There are two photographs. The first is from 1993. A woman is holding a newborn baby. She is 30 years old. She is the most famous singer on earth. The woman whose voice has been described by critics and musicians, and the people who simply loved music as the finest instrument of its generation. She has sold more than 100 million records. She has won every award the industry can give. She has a voice that does something to people. Something physical, something that lands in the chest before the brain has processed what it is hearing, that no other voice does in quite the same way. She is holding her daughter for the first time. Her name is Whitney Houston. Her daughter's name is Bobbi Kristina Brown. And the photograph, the specific, luminous quality of that image, the way Whitney Houston is looking at her newborn child, captures something that the next 22 years will complicate and damage and ultimately not survive. She is looking at her daughter like she is the answer to something. The second photograph is from 2012. It was taken at a party at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Los Angeles, the night before the Grammy Awards, the night when the music industry assembles itself in one building to celebrate the best of what it has produced. The night that Whitney Houston had attended many times before. The night that she was attending again in February 2012 as a guest of her longtime mentor and friend Clive Davis. The photograph shows Whitney Houston at that party. She is smiling. She looks tired. She looks, to the people who knew her, who have described this photograph in interviews in the years since, like a woman who is carrying something heavy that the smile is working to conceal. She died the next morning. She was found face down in a water-filled bathtub in a suite upstairs at the Beverly Hilton, hours before the Grammy party she had been attending the previous evening was scheduled to begin. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled her death an accidental drowning. Her autopsy report stated that drowning was due to the effects of atherosclerotic heart disease and cocaine use. She was 48 years old. And then, in the specific, cruel way that this story refuses to end, nearly 3 years later, on January 31, 2015, her daughter, Bobbi Kristina Brown, was found unconscious in her bathtub at the Georgia home she shared with her partner, Nick Gordon. Bobbi Kristina died 6 months later, on July 26, 2015. She was 22 years old. Mother and daughter, both found unconscious in bathtubs, 3 years apart, both dead before their time. I am Mary. And today this channel is going to tell the story that the Grammy tributes and the biographical documentaries and the years of coverage about Whitney Houston's voice and Whitney Houston's marriage and Whitney Houston's addiction have not told fully. Not the story of the voice, not the story of the fall. The story of what happened to the child who was born into all of it, who inherited the fame and the damage and the specific, consuming world of Whitney Houston, and who nobody protected. Bobbi Kristina Brown was born on March 4, 1993, in Livingston, New Jersey. She was 22 years old when she died. She spent her entire life in the specific, impossible position of being Whitney Houston's daughter, loved by a woman whose capacity to love was being consumed by the same forces that were consuming everything else. Nobody asked, loudly enough, what that cost her. This video is going to ask. Before the bathtub, before Nick Gordon and the coma and the 6 months of life support and the family war that broke out at her own memorial, there was a childhood, and the childhood that Bobbi Kristina Brown lived. Inside the most famous marriage in music, watching the woman she loved most in the world disappear inside something that nobody could stop, is the part of this story that explains everything that came after. That is coming. The childhood Bobbi Kristina Brown was born into a world that was already famous before she could speak. Her mother was Whitney Houston. Her father was Bobby Brown. an R&B singer whose career had been one of the defining sounds of the late 1980s, whose album Don't Be Cruel had sold 12 million copies, whose stage presence and natural charisma had made him one of the most recognizable figures in American music before he was 25 years old. On July 18, 1992, Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown married at her home in front of a star-studded guest list of 800 people. Bobbi Kristina was born 8 months later. She came into the world with the specific weight of that combination, the most famous woman in music, and the man who had been one of its defining bad boys, and she grew up carrying it before she was old enough to understand what she was carrying. The house she grew up in was large. It was in Mendham, New Jersey, a private, heavily secured estate that the money from Whitney Houston's extraordinary career had purchased, that had the specific, insulating quality of wealth that can make the world outside seem very far away. The paparazzi camped at the gates. The security staff managed the perimeter. And inside, in the specific, private reality of the home, that none of the cameras were permitted to enter. A child was growing up in a household shaped by two parents whose relationship to the substances they were consuming was changing everything around them. Bobby Brown later confessed that during his marriage to Houston, the pair would hide away in a wing of their mansion and do drugs together. They would have nanny's care for Bobbi Kristina, who was very young at the time, in an effort to ensure she never got to see them in that situation. He said they were doing drugs every day, every day. The nannies were with Bobbi Kristina. Her parents were in the other wing. Now, here is the honest thing this video wants to say about what that arrangement produced in a child. Children know. Not in the analytical, articulable way of adults, who can describe what they are observing and name its implications, but in the wordless, absorbed, body-level way that children know the things they are immersed in. They know when the energy of a house is wrong. They know when the people who are supposed to be present are absent in ways that have nothing to do with physical location. They know when the nanny is the person who feels safe and the parents, who are in the other wing, doing what they are doing, are the people who feel unreachable. Bobbi Kristina knew. Bobby Brown later said in his autobiography, "How much quality time can you spend with your daughter when you're high all the time? I would get really mad at Whitney, scream and yell that I wanted a divorce. This went on for years and years. Our daughter saw it all. Our daughter saw it all." Bobby Brown said this himself. He said it looking back. From the specific, clarifying distance of years and loss, and the particular honesty that arrives when the things you were not honest about have already produced their consequences. He said it, knowing that his daughter was dead when he said it. He said it as a man who had arrived at the accounting and found the numbers did not add up in his favor. Our daughter saw it all. And then, in 2005, when Bobbi Kristina was 12 years old, the thing that had been private became public. Being Bobby Brown was an 11-episode reality series that debuted on Bravo on June 30, 2005. It followed Bobby Brown, Whitney Houston, their daughter Bobbi Kristina, his children from previous relationships, and his extended family over the course of 6 months. Bobbi Kris was 12 years old. She appeared on camera. She appeared on camera in a show whose purpose was to document the life of a household that, in the specific documented reality of what was happening inside it, was a household in crisis. A household in which both parents were struggling with addiction. A household in which the marriage was deteriorating in ways that the camera occasionally caught and that the production occasionally used for the specific ratings-generating quality of chaos that reality television had discovered was more compelling than scripted drama. During the filming period, Bobbi Brown was jailed for about a month after multiple probation violations. One of the violations involved striking Houston. He was jailed during the filming of the show for striking his wife, while their daughter was 12 years old, while the cameras were running. The show was one of the most watched programs on Bravo that summer. And here is the specific, honest question this video wants to ask about. That show, not about the ratings, not about the entertainment value, not about what it revealed about celebrity culture in 2005. Who protected Bobbi Kristina? Not from the cameras, though the cameras were a problem. Not from the public exposure, though the public exposure was a problem. Who protected her from what was happening inside the house? Bobbi Kristina's childhood can be characterized as rough because of it being filled with the existence of paparazzi and also with Bobbi and Whitney's drug use. That sentence, delivered in the specific, factual way of a biographical summary, contains a childhood, paparazzi at the gates, drug use inside. A reality show that made both visible to 30 million viewers. And a 12-year-old girl in the middle of it, appearing on camera, smiling when the camera required a smile, being what the show required her to be, while her parents were in crisis in the specific, documented, publicly acknowledged way that her parents were in crisis. Whitney Houston later told Oprah Winfrey in 2009, "I never cheated. I never did none of that stuff. I just did the drugs. I just did the drugs." She said this about a marriage that produced a child who was growing up inside what she just did, watching, absorbing, learning, in the specific, permanent, wordless way that children learn the things that define the rest of their lives. What love looked like, what home felt like, what it meant to be the most important person in a room full of people who were not fully present in that room. And then, in 2007, Whitney Houston and Bobbi Brown divorced. Houston obtained custody of Bobbi Kristina. She was 14 years old. The marriage was over. The drugs were not. After the divorce, after the cameras from being Bobbi Brown were gone, and the marriage was legally ended, and Bobbi Kristina was 14 years old with her mother, and the specific quiet aftermath of a childhood that had been lived in public. Whitney Houston's career began the specific, documented decline that the world watched and discussed and analysed for years. What Bobbi Kristina watched, what she tried to do about it, and what happened to a teenager who loved her mother with everything she had and could not make that love enough to stop what was coming, is coming. The decline Bobbi Kristina watched after the divorce, after the cameras from being Bobbi Brown were gone, and the marriage was legally over, and Bobbi Kristina was 14 years old in her mother's custody. Whitney Houston attempted something. She attempted to come back, not just to the music, though the music was part of it, but to herself, to the version of herself that existed before the marriage and the drugs. The drugs had done what they had done to the specific, irreplaceable instrument that had defined her career. She worked on an album, she went to rehab, she talked to Oprah, and in September 2009, 6 years after her last studio album, 7 years after the public had last seen her at full capacity, she stood on a stage in Central Park in New York City and performed in front of 4,000 people who had been lining up since the night before to see if the voice was still there. As her band kicked in, her voice began to crack and she sounded out of breath halfway through the track. It was a trend that continued throughout the performance. Houston apologized to the crowd for her voice. She apologized to the crowd for her voice. The voice that had been described by musicians and critics, and the people who simply loved music as one of the finest instruments of the 20th century, was cracking in Central Park in September 2009. And its owner was apologizing to the crowd for what had happened to it. Bobbi Kristina made a brief cameo during the performance. She was there, 16 years old, watching her mother perform on that stage, watching the crowd who had lined up all night to see the comeback, watching the specific public moment when the gap between what Whitney Houston had been and what she was now became visible to everyone simultaneously. Bobbi Kristina was 16 years old. She watched all of it. The album, I Look to You, entered the Billboard charts at #1 despite mixed reviews. A 2010 European tour was a sad spectacle of missed high notes and cancelled performances. In May 2011, she returned to rehab as an outpatient, citing drug and alcohol problems. #1 album, European tour, rehab again. This is the specific exhausting cycle that addiction produces. The genuine attempt, the partial recovery, the public performance of the comeback, the private continuation of the thing the comeback was supposed to end. The album chart position and the tour dates and the Oprah interview existing simultaneously with the missed high notes and the cancelled performances and the quiet return to treatment. And Bobbi Kristina, who was 16, then 17, then 18, was watching all of it from the inside. A family member described her relationship with her mother to the Daily Beast in 2012. Bobbi Kristina was her friend, confidant, and her protector. She loved her so much and never gave up on her. Her protector, a teenager, protecting her mother. This is the detail that this video wants to sit with for a moment. Not because it is unusual in the specific, documented world of addiction, where the people who love the person who is addicted often become the person most responsible for managing the consequences, but because of what it means for Bobbi Kristina specifically. She had spent her childhood watching. Now she was spending her adolescence protecting. The role had shifted from witness to caretaker. She was not yet 20 years old. After the divorce, Whitney seemed to be making up for lost time with her daughter. Mother and daughter had begun working together on songs in the recording studio. They were recording together. This is the detail that the years of coverage about Whitney Houston's decline have not fully examined. The specific documented reality that in the final years of Whitney Houston's life, her primary relationship was with her daughter. That Bobbi Kristina was not just present in her mother's life, but central to it. That the woman who had spent Bobbi Kristina's childhood in another wing of the house, with the nannies managing the child, while the parents managed their addiction, had in these final years made her daughter her closest companion, the friend, the confidant, the protector. And then came February 2012. Whitney Houston had been at the Beverly Hilton Hotel for Clive Davis's annual pre-Grammy party. The event that the music industry assembled itself around every year on the night before the Grammys. The gathering of the people who had built the machinery that had made Whitney Houston who she was. She was still a musical icon who was supposed to attend Clive Davis's annual pre-Grammy gala at the Beverly Hilton Hotel on February 11, 2012. Instead, the 48-year-old accidentally drowned in a bathtub in a suite upstairs hours beforehand, and the party became an impromptu memorial. She drowned in a bathtub in a hotel suite, upstairs from the party, alone. Bobbi Kristina was with her mother in Los Angeles that night. When Whitney was found, police reportedly turned Bobbi Kristina away from seeing her mother in the hotel room. The then 18-year-old had to be taken by ambulance to the hospital, where she was treated for stress and anxiety. She was turned away from the door. The police were inside. Her mother was inside. And Bobbi Kristina, 18 years old, the friend and confidant and protector. The girl who had been watching since she was old enough to understand what she was watching was standing outside a hotel room door being told she could not go in. She was taken to hospital by ambulance for stress and anxiety. the clinical language of a medical report, for the specific, unsurvivable weight of standing outside a door and being told no, for being 18 years old and losing the one person who had been in the specific, documented reality of the last 5 years, the centre of her world, the friend, the confidant, the woman she had been protecting. After Houston's death, Bobbi Kristina expressed a desire to pursue a singing career like her parents. She wanted to sing like her mother. She wanted to carry the voice forward. The voice that had cracked in Central Park, the voice that had made the crowd in 30 million living rooms feel something in their chests before their brains had processed what it was, into whatever came next. She was 18 years old. Her mother was dead. And the machinery that had built Whitney Houston, that had consumed Whitney Houston, that had been present at every stage of the rise and the fall and the comeback and the decline, was about to turn its attention to the daughter. In the weeks and months after Whitney Houston's death, after Bobbi Kristina was turned away from the hotel room door and taken to hospital, and her father flew to Los Angeles, and the world's grief descended on an 18-year-old girl who had just lost the only person she described as her best friend. A man named Nick Gordon became the centre of her life. Who Nick Gordon was, how he came to be inside the Houston household, what his relationship with Bobbi Kristina actually looked like, and what Bobby Brown said years later about what he believed Nick Gordon had done, is coming. Nick Gordon. To understand what happened to Bobbi Kristina Brown after her mother died, you have to understand who Nick Gordon was. Not who the tabloids decided he was. Not the villain of the story, not the devoted partner, not the innocent bystander, not any of the specific, simplified versions of a human that coverage of this kind produces. Who he actually was. Nicholas David Gordon was born on May 5, 1989 in Roswell, Georgia. Details about his biological parents remain undisclosed. At the age of 12, he was informally taken in by the legendary singer Whitney Houston, who raised him alongside her daughter, Bobbi Kristina Brown. He was 12 years old when Whitney Houston brought him into her home. He was 12 years old, an orphan, without parents, without the specific foundational security that parents provide even when they are imperfect. When one of the most famous women in the world became the person who fed him and housed him and told him, in whatever word she found, that he had a home. Whitney once said that Nick was like a son to her. Before he died, Nick said that Whitney was like his mother, and that they had a really cool relationship that he would miss forever. He said, it was like a mother-son relationship. It really was. He called her Mom. He had a tattoo of her face on his arm. He sat in the family pew at her funeral. At Whitney Houston's funeral, in a pew reserved for family, a young man sat beside the singer's daughter, Bobbi Kristina, and her mother, Cissy Houston. He was 22-year-old Nick Gordon. Though not related by blood to Houston, Gordon was like a son to her, her brother Michael Houston told ABC News. He was at the funeral, in the family pew. And here is what makes the story of Nick Gordon and Bobbi Kristina so specifically, documentably complicated. Growing up in the Houston household, Gordon developed a sibling-like bond with Bobbi Kristina. However, as they matured, their relationship evolved into a romantic one, which garnered significant media attention. They had grown up together, in the same house, as something approximating siblings. The girl whose mother ran the household, and the boy whose mother had brought him in from outside. And then Whitney Houston died. And 8 months after the death, 8 months after Bobbi Kristina had been turned away from the hotel room door and taken to hospital by ambulance, Bobbi Kristina announced her engagement to Nick Gordon. Their relationship was featured on the Lifetime reality show The Houstons, On Our Own, which premiered in May 2012. The engagement announcement produced an immediate, fierce reaction from the Houston family. Cissy Houston, Whitney's own mother, once called the relationship incestuous. Cissy Houston, Whitney's mother, the woman who had been the family's foundation for decades, the gospel singer, the choir director, the woman who had recognized Whitney's voice at 5 years old and shaped it into what it became, used the word incestuous about her granddaughter's relationship. Bobby Brown was alarmed. He did not approve. He said so publicly. And Bobbi Kristina, who was 18, then 19, then 20, navigating grief so enormous that it had required an ambulance on the night it began, trying to build something in the ruins of what she had lost, stayed with Nick Gordon. Gordon was never legally adopted by the singer, nor was he left anything in her will. Instead, Houston left her entire estate to her only child, Bobbi Kristina Brown. He was not in the will. He had no legal claim to anything Whitney Houston had left behind. And Bobbi Kristina, who had inherited Whitney Houston's entire estate, who was supposed to access it fully when she turned 30, was the person he was living with now. Here is the honest thing this video wants to say about what is documented and what is alleged. Nick Gordon denied wrongdoing. He was never criminally charged in connection with Bobbi Kristina's death. His lawyers described the civil lawsuit allegations as slanderous and meritless. He maintained until his own death that he had loved Bobbi Kristina completely and that he had done nothing to harm her. These are the facts of the criminal record. And here is what the civil record shows. The civil lawsuit alleged that days before Bobbi Kristina was found unconscious, Gordon hit her in the face, knocked her to the floor, and continued to beat her in the face until she was bloody. According to the court complaint, Gordon arrived at Bobbi Kristina's townhouse on January 31 at 6 a.m. after being out all night on a cocaine and drinking binge. The papers allege that Gordon and Bobbi Kristina became embroiled in a loud argument that ended in the master bedroom. The argument lasted for about 30 minutes, and then everything abruptly became quiet. Everything became quiet. The lawsuit alleged that Gordon gave Bobbi Kristina a toxic cocktail, rendering her unconscious, after which he put her face down in a tub of cold water, causing her to suffer brain damage. He denied it. He was never charged. In September 2016, a judge found that because Gordon failed to appear in court on 2 scheduled dates, anything alleged by the plaintiff was admitted through omission. Gordon was found legally responsible for Bobbi Kristina's wrongful death and ordered to pay $36 million to her estate. $36 million. Found legally responsible. By default, by failing to appear, but legally responsible nonetheless. And Bobby Brown, the man who had not been present enough during Bobbi Kristina's childhood, who had confessed on national television that his daughter had seen it all, who had rushed to his daughter's side when she was in hospital and had watched her die in hospice care 6 months later, said what he believed in a 2021 interview. He was the only one there with both situations, with my ex-wife and my daughter. And they both died the same way, Bobby Brown said. He knows what happened. Both situations, his ex-wife, his daughter, the same man present, the same way. Nick Gordon died on January 1, 2020, from a suspected drug overdose. He was 30 years old. He died without ever being charged, without ever being fully held accountable by the criminal system, without ever giving the public account of January 31, 2015, that Bobbi Kristina's family spent years trying to obtain. He died at 30, 3 years after the woman he called his wife, 5 years after the woman who had called him her son. On January 31, 2015, the day everything became quiet in that townhouse in Georgia, Bobbi Kristina Brown was found face down and unconscious in a bathtub, almost exactly 3 years after her mother. The 6 months that followed, What her family did, what her body could not do, the family war that erupted at her own memorial service, and the specific, documented question that nobody in the criminal system has ever answered is coming. The 6 months. On the morning of January 31, 2015, Bobbi Kristina Brown posted a photograph to Instagram. It was posted at approximately 2 a.m. Eastern Time. She was 21 years old. She was in her townhouse in Roswell, Georgia. The home she shared with Nick Gordon, the man she called her husband, the man who had grown up in her mother's house as something approximating her brother, and had become, in the 3 years since her mother died, the center of her world. Hours later, she was found face down in her bathtub, alive but unresponsive. Nick Gordon performed CPR. A friend called 911. Paramedics arrived. Bobbi Kristina was transported to North Fulton Hospital, reportedly stabilized and breathing. She was later placed in a medically induced coma and on a ventilator. The news broke within hours. And within hours of the news breaking, within hours of the reports confirming that Bobbi Kristina Brown had been found face down and unresponsive in a bathtub. Almost exactly 3 years after her mother had been found face down and unresponsive in a bathtub, the world responded with the specific, consuming attention it always gave to this family. The cameras assembled outside the hospital. The reporters filed their first dispatches. The public, which had watched Whitney Houston's decline for years, and had watched Bobbi Kristina navigate the aftermath of her mother's death, with the specific, documented difficulty of someone who had lost the most important person in her life, held its breath. Bobbi Brown flew to Atlanta. Sissy Houston, Whitney's mother, Bobbi Kristina's grandmother, released a statement after visiting her granddaughter in the hospital. While she is no longer in a medically induced coma, she has a tracheotomy, and according to the doctors, she has global and irreversible brain damage and remains unresponsive. Meeting with the doctors and understanding that she can live in this condition for a lifetime truly saddens me. We can only trust in God for a miracle at this time. Global and irreversible brain damage. Can live in this condition for a lifetime. Sissy Houston was 91 years old. She was the woman who had recognized Whitney's voice at 5 years old and spent a lifetime shaping it. She had buried her daughter. She was now sitting in a hospital in Atlanta looking at her granddaughter, the child who had said, "Sing Mommy," at the beginning of her mother's recording sessions, who had appeared on stage with Whitney at Central Park, who had been turned away from a hotel room door 3 years earlier, and being told the word irreversible. The 6 months that followed were the specific, unendurable waiting that irreversible produces. Bobbi Kristina was moved to a rehabilitation facility in mid-March. Doctors had removed her breathing tube, allowing her to be ventilated through a hole in her throat. She could not breathe on her own. She could not speak. She could not respond. The brain that had grown up watching and absorbing and protecting, the mind that had spent 21 years inside the specific, consuming world of Whitney Houston, was no longer accessible from the outside. Bobbi Brown gave updates at concerts. During one concert, he said his daughter was awake. His lawyer later clarified that he had been in an emotional state on stage. He wanted her to be awake. He said it out loud because wanting it badly enough felt like it should make it true. It did not make it true. In June 2015, Bobbi Kristina was moved to Peachtree Christian Hospice in Duluth, Georgia. When a patient is moved to hospice, the medical language for what the family has accepted is this: they have given up hope that she will recover. She was 22 years old. She was moved to hospice. On July 26, 2015, Bobbi Kristina Brown died. She was 22 years old. She is finally at peace in the arms of God, her family said in a statement. We want to again thank everyone for their tremendous amount of love and support during these last few months. She is finally at peace, in the arms of God. She died on July 26, 2015, almost exactly 3 years after the night she had been turned away from a hotel room door in Beverly Hills. And then, in the specific additional cruelty that this story appended to everything that had already happened, the memorial service became a war. The ongoing tensions between the families of Whitney Houston and Bobbi Brown erupted during the memorial service at St. James United Methodist Church in Alpharetta, Georgia. Leola Brown, Bobbi Brown's sister, walked out of the church and spoke to reporters gathered outside. She said she was angry because Pat Houston was speaking at the funeral. Pat Houston was the sister-in-law and former manager of the late Whitney Houston. She walked out, during the service, for a 22-year-old girl. I told her that Whitney is going to haunt her from the grave. Leola Brown told reporters outside the church. She suggested that the feud between the Houstons and the Browns was far from over. It's just getting started, she said. It's just getting started. At a memorial service. For a child who had spent her entire life caught between these two families, born to their marriage, shaped by their damage, watching their fights through the walls, since she was old enough to understand what fighting meant. She was dead at 22, and the families she had come from were fighting outside the church, where her coffin was sitting. On August 3, 2015, Bobbi Kristina Brown was laid to rest next to her mother at Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey. The hearse carrying her body made the short trip to Wigham Funeral Home, the same facility that had handled Whitney Houston's funeral arrangements 3 years earlier. The same funeral home. 3 years later, mother and daughter, together in the same cemetery, the way they had been together in the same hospital, the same kind of bathtub, the same specific, documented pattern that this story had been building toward since the night Bobbi Kristina was born. The official autopsy report confirmed that Bobbi Kristina Brown's cause of death was lobar pneumonia due to her face being immersed in water, complicating mixed drug intoxication, along with hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, brain damage caused by lack of oxygen. Brain damage caused by lack of oxygen, face immersed in water, mixed drug intoxication, the medical examiner's language. For a 22-year-old girl, buried next to her mother, in the same cemetery, in the same state she had been born in, there is a question at the center of this story that nobody has fully answered. Not the criminal investigation, which was opened and never produced charges. Not the civil lawsuit, which produced a $36 million judgment by default against a man who died of an overdose before paying a single dollar. Not the documentaries or the tributes or the years of coverage about Whitney Houston's voice and Whitney Houston's marriage. The question about what the industry that built Whitney Houston owed Bobbi Kristina, and what the people around both of them saw and did not say, is coming. Whitney Houston left her entire estate to Bobbi Kristina. Everything. The music catalogue. The royalties. The assets accumulated across a career that had produced more than 200 million record sales and made her one of the most commercially successful artists in the history of American music. All of it to her daughter. According to Houston's will, the assets were to be distributed in 3 installments: 10% at 21, 30% at 25, the remainder at 30. When she turned 21, Bobbi Kristina received 10%, reportedly about $2 million. She was 21 years old. She had been turned away from a hotel room door 2 years earlier. She was living with Nick Gordon. She was grieving in the specific, consuming way of someone who has lost the person who was simultaneously her mother, her best friend, and the anchor of her entire existence, and who has been given, by An industry that does not have a framework for that kind of grief. No support structure other than the money and the cameras and the relentless attention of a world that found her interesting primarily because of who her mother had been. Whitney Houston had left everything to her only child, who was just 19 years old when she died, leading many to worry that someone so young would not be able to handle the money or the people who would inevitably prey on her for access to it. Many people worried. Nobody intervened. She was 19 when her mother died. She was 21 when the first installment arrived. She was 22 when she was found face down in a bathtub. She died without a will. Because Bobbi Kristina died unmarried and without children and without a will before the age of 30, the remainder of Whitney Houston's estate reverted to Whitney Houston's living relatives. Her mother, Sissy, and her two brothers. The money she was supposed to receive at 25. The money she was supposed to receive at 30. Gone. Because Bobbi Kristina never turned 25. Because the 30 that Whitney Houston had planned for never came. Here is the question this video needs to ask directly. Not about the will. Not about the legal structure. About the people around her. Bobbi Kristina Brown was 22 years old. She had lost her mother at 18. She had grown up watching her parents consume themselves while reality television cameras documented it. She had spent her adolescence protecting the person she loved most. She had been turned away from a hotel room door. She had inherited a fortune. She had announced a relationship her grandmother called incestuous. She had gone on a reality show to document her grief. And somewhere in those 3 years between the night her mother died and the morning she was found in her bathtub, nobody in the circle around her intervened in a way that changed what happened. Bobby Brown said it himself. We should have been better. We could have been better. About himself. About Whitney both. And then, November 2020, Bobby Brown Jr. was found dead in his Los Angeles home. He was 28 years old. Alcohol, cocaine, and fentanyl. Ruled accidental, Bobby Brown had now lost 2 children. Bobbi Kristina at 22, Bobby Jr. at 28. I know that my time played a part in my son feeling he could test something, Bobby Brown said. I feel guilty about that. The same wing, the same every day. The same children watching from the other side of the door. The industry owed Bobbi Kristina protection it never provided. Not the money, not the reality shows, not the Grammy appearances. The specific, unglamorous protection of someone whose job was to notice that a 19-year-old girl had just lost her mother, was now living with a man her family was alarmed about, was posting on Instagram at 2 a.m., and had no one whose primary obligation was to her rather than to the mythology she had inherited. The industry had a framework for Whitney Houston's voice. It did not have a framework for Bobbi Kristina. It never asked what she needed. It only asked what she could produce: a reality show, an Instagram account, a face the cameras recognized because it looked like Whitney Houston's face. And when there was nothing left to produce, it moved on, the way it always moves on. There is one final question this video has not asked. Not about Bobbi Kristina, whose story has been told in full. Not about Whitney, whose voice and loss the world has spent 13 years describing. But about the pattern. What it means that the same bathtub, the same drugs, the same absence of protection produced the same outcome in a mother and her daughter 3 years apart, is coming. There is a detail this video has been building towards since part 1. Not the bathtubs, not the drugs, this. In the months before January 31, 2015, Bobbi Kristina posted on Instagram, "What do I really do? God, help me ignore and rebuke what these demons are saying, in Jesus' name." She posted it publicly, on Instagram, where anyone could read it. She was 21 years old. And that post That specific public, urgent prayer from a 21-year-old girl is the detail that the coverage of this story has never examined with the weight it deserves. Because she was not posting in secret. She was not whispering it to a therapist. She was not calling a helpline. She was posting it on Instagram. Because the world Bobbi Kristina Brown had been given did not offer her another container for what she was carrying. Not a treatment program. Not a person whose job was to protect her. Instagram, one director noted after her death. She seemed to be caught in the web of celebrity upon arrival, born into it, famous at birth. A child whose first public appearance was saying, "Sing Mommy," into a microphone. Whose parents' marriage was documented on reality television at 12. Whose mother's death produced a grief so public that the girl who needed to process it privately was given an Oprah interview instead. She did not survive it. Bobby Brown wrote in his autobiography, "For some reason, Whitney's drug use got worse after Bobbi Kris was born. I would try to keep Whitney locked in the room, telling her she shouldn't come in front of our daughter because of the way the drugs affected her." He tried to keep Whitney away from their daughter because the addiction was visible in ways a toddler would absorb without understanding. And research on children of addicted parents is not ambiguous. According to experts, two things transmit addiction through families: genetics and grief, and the way they work in tandem can ruin a family. Addiction has long-reaching tentacles, one interventionist noted. A big predictor is interruption in experience with a parent, specifically the same-sex parent. Interruption in experience with a parent. Whitney Houston was not present for Bobbi Kristina in the ways a mother is supposed to be present. Not because she did not love her. She loved her, but love and presence are not the same thing. And Whitney, who had been carrying her own interrupted childhood, her own murdered father, her own damage absorbed before she had the framework to process it, was not fully present in the foundational years, when a child builds the architecture that teaches them how to survive. Bobbi Kristina's nervous system was shaped in a household where both parents were using every day, where the arguments lasted for years, where the daughter saw it all. And when Whitney died, when the 18-year-old was turned away from the hotel room door, that grief did not land on neutral ground. It landed on 21 years of accumulated damage. From a rumored suicide attempt at 15 to substance abuse allegations after Houston's death, Bobbi Kristina had continually struggled. She had been struggling since she was 15. She struggled through the death. She struggled in the years after. She posted about demons on Instagram. And the world that had watched her mother's decline did not build a framework for what the decline produced in the daughter. It built a framework for the comeback. It built a framework for the tribute. It did not build a framework for the 21-year-old asking God for help. It built a framework for the next story. And Bobbi Kristina was the next story until she was in a hospital in Atlanta with irreversible brain damage. And then she was the story again for 6 months. And then she was in a cemetery in New Jersey next to her mother. And then the world moved on, the way it always moves on. There is one final question, not about the bathtubs, not about Nick Gordon, the question about what Bobbi Kristina Brown deserved. Not from the law, not from the courts, but from the people who were responsible for her. And what the honest accounting of that responsibility looks like is coming. Let me tell you what this video has actually been about. It has not been about the bathtubs. The bathtubs are where the coverage always goes. But the bathtubs are not where the story begins. The story begins on March 4, 1993, in Livingston, New Jersey, when a child was born into the most famous household in American music, a household where both parents were using drugs every day, where the arguments went on for years, and the daughter saw it all, where a 12-year-old appeared on reality television, while her father was jailed for striking her mother, where a teenager was rumoured to have attempted suicide at 15, and the world did not ask why, where an 18-year-old was turned away from a hotel room door and given a grief counsellor and a reality show, not a protected environment, a reality show, and an Instagram account, and $2 million from an estate whose framework assumed a future that nobody protected. This video has been about the specific, documented cost of an industry that builds mythologies without building protections. Whitney Houston's voice was extraordinary. This is not in dispute. It was one of the finest instruments of the 20th century. The voice was a gift. The industry that received the gift did not protect the person it came from. And it did not protect the daughter who was born into the mythology, who never chose it, who said, "Sing mommy," before she could read, who watched through the walls, who became the protector, who was turned away from the door, who asked God for help with demons on Instagram, who was 22 years old when she died, who never turned 25, who never turned 30. She was overwhelmed by the achievements and demons of others before she could begin to figure out who she was. She never got to find out. She was Bobbi Kristina Brown, not Whitney Houston's daughter, Bobbi Kristina Brown. And nobody built a framework for what she needed. Now, two things before you go. The first is what Bobbi Brown built after she died. Bobbi Brown and his wife launched the Bobbi Kristina Serenity House, a non-profit offering 24-hour support to survivors of domestic violence. He built something with her name, not to manage the mythology, not to produce the next story, to offer the unglamorous practical support his daughter did not receive. That is not nothing. It is the specific, concrete thing a man who said we should have been better did to be better. The second is a question. Whitney Houston died at 48. Bobbi Kristina Brown died at 22. Bobby Brown Jr. died at 28. 3 people, 3 deaths, the same family, the same drugs, the same absence of protection. The pattern is not a mystery. The pattern is documented. And the industry that built the mythology was present for all of it. It was present for the voice. It was not present for the damage. It consumed the gift and left the cost to the people standing in the other wing, watching, absorbing, asking God for help on Instagram. What does the world that watched it happen owe to the next child born into that mythology? The next child who says, "Sing mommy." The next child who watches through the walls. The next child who is given a reality show instead of a protected environment. The next child who posts about demons at 2 a.m. Because the industry has not answered that question. It has moved on. It always moves on. Leave me your answer below. I read every single one. Because the industry remembers Whitney Houston's voice. This video was about what the voice cost the daughter, and what the daughter deserved, that nobody provided. This is Mary of Shadows. Thank you for being here.